Born Mark Anthony Luhrman in Sydney, New South Wales, Baz Luhrman grew up ballroom dancing, writing and acting. When his endeavours drew him to the prestigious National Institute of Dramatic Art, NIDA, Baz co-wrote with Craig Pearce a play titled Strictly Ballroom. After one of the nights this play was performed at the Sydney Wharf Theatre, music executive Ted Albert asked whether Luhrman would be interested in adapting it to screen. Baz only agreed on the condition he would direct the film, and thus, the first Luhrman extravaganza went into production. Ever since, Australian cinema has not been the same. Luhrmann's introductory motion picture was arguably one of the biggest Australian films of 1992, and Strictly Ballroom's screening at the Cannes Film Festival cemented Luhrmann's place in the Australian film industry. Prior to Luhrmann, Australian films were partial to a rugged hero whose bravery and true grit saved the day against an obvious and unquestionable evil. We can see, however, how these films such as 1979's Mad Max, 1981's Gallipoli, Romper Stomper from 1992, and 1986's Crocodile Dundee have influenced Luhrmann's characters. Strictly Ballroom, Moulin Rouge, Australia, and The Great Gatsby all tell the story of an underdog man who defies obstacles in their journeys, but uncharacteristic to the previous Australian model is that each of these characters' motivations stem from a deep-seated romanticism. Australia's beautifully dangerous landscape or an appreciation for such surroundings have also been a huge visual component in many Australian popular films. But Luhrmann, ever the visionary, emboldens the simplicity, collaborating with his wife Kathryn Brown to draw character and spectacle from sets and costumes. This divergence from Australian customs to instead develop his own, evident in his entire filmography, is what makes Baz Luhrmann a modern-day auteur. Derived from French, auteur is used to define a director who is so involved in the development of their films that rather than the more typical collaboration to produce a film, they are considered the creative author of their productions. Luhrmann is praised as one of the most recent directors to reach auteur status, from the obvious recurring themes and stylistic conventions of his film library. Such themes that Baz Luhrmann revisits are past and modern social class distinction, the battle against parental and social expectations, and unquestionably the most important, love, and what we can be driven to do to achieve it.
The greatest thing you'll ever learn is just to love and be loved in return.
To become an auteur, Luhrmann had a hand in the writing and directing of all of his films, as well as influence in the production design and famously soundtrack compilation. The visual style and symbolism of a Luhrmann are identifiable, but it all began in 1992 with some poppy, frilly and sequin ballroom costumes.
What does Strictly Ballroom mean to you?
Oh, what doesn't it mean to me? It's just such a big deal, big part of my life. You know, I wrote and directed and acted in it back in NIDA. And it would have felt weird in anyone else's hands if anyone else directed it. So, yeah, it means a lot to me, if that answers your question.
Baz's first feature had a strong connection to his own life. His childhood experiences of being a ballroom dancer provided him with a rare context to refer to when he concocted the entertaining Australian tale. It is in Strictly that we get a first glimpse at the unique stylings of Luhrmann to come. Strictly Ballroom is the first in the Red Curtain trilogy, named for the theatrical approach to storytelling each film employs. The three films explore a different medium of artistic expression: Strictly Ballroom, dance, Romeo and Juliet, poetry, and Moulin Rouge, music, to show how powerful they can be when telling a tale. This trilogy characteristic explains why each film's plot almost plagiarized the others, but allows Luhrmann to experiment with motifs and the ending of each beautiful film. Baz has expressed his fascination with delivering a myth to the audience, motivated by the belief that everyone watches a film with the expectation of a narrative that is influenced by the myths and fairy tales we all exclusively hold to our hearts. Luhrmann understands such myths have come about from an audience's wish to hear them over and over and over again.
How do you think Shakespeare would react to your interpretation?
I mean, I just tried to update it, to be honest, for like a modern audience, but also be faithful to his original work. I mean, Romeo and Juliet is just such a classic, you know, tale that stands the test of time. It's such an insane, tragic story. I just tried to chuck a few old film techniques in there and mix it with the story and see what came out of it. I hope I've done it justice.
Baz Luhrmann's next big conquest was one that surprised audiences the most. Romeo and Juliet got the Baz Luhrmann makeover and became a spectacular reimagining of the famous Shakespearean play with all the stylistic conventions of the growing auteur. Luhrmann addresses through subtext in Romeo and Juliet the permanence of media and proves his theory of mythology true. The film repeats similar themes as Strictly Ballroom as Baz experiments with an almost alternate ending. We can see how circumstance is a game of luck that reaps tragic or euphoric outcomes with disregard to dedication of one's beliefs. In Strictly Ballroom, spontaneous love and rejection of expectations make the bond of the main duo stronger. As Baz intended, in Romeo and Juliet we find that the same motivations and overcoming of challenges ends with the completely dichotomized outcome. Once again, the production design embellishes reality with a colourful swatch in costumes that personalise the characters and communicate symbolic reasoning to the audience. Unlike Strictly Ballroom, there are far fewer ties to Australian culture in Romeo and Juliet, besides collaborating once again behind the scenes with co-writer Craig Pearce and Australian editor Jill Bilcock. Bilcock and Luhrmann's signatures are written on every cut in the Red Curtain trilogy, as the two spent many hours together deliberating to produce not only a unique version of Romeo and Juliet, but an original style of editing for the genres of each of the three films, a perfect professional relationship that to date has only produced one other film.
So Baz, why is it called the Red Curtain trilogy?
Well, they're all connected thematically, and but narratively I can play around with the circumstances and the endings, and I can kind of tell the same story, but have different things happening. They're all tragic love stories, but they all end differently. Romeo and Juliet, they want to be together, but they kill themselves, and with Strictly Ballroom they do end up together, and Moulin Rouge, one's left without the other. I think it's called the Red Curtain trilogy because it's loosely connected, but not connected enough so a director like me can still play around with my stories.
5 years on from Luhrmann's international success with Romeo and Juliet, the final installment of the trilogy was released. Moulin Rouge marked a third alternate telling of the myth Baz had previously explored, perhaps becoming the saddest rendition when one lead survives without the other rather than both or neither. Luhrmann's final reoccurring stylistic choice is the opening and closing sequences of each film, occurring on a parallel chronology to the film's events. Strictly Ballroom opens by parodying documentary interviews about an event that takes place before the film's plot, whereas Romeo and Juliet has a smash cut of the entire film as an opening sequence and a news broadcast delivery of the script's final lines in closing. Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge opening puts the story in the hands of the main character literally, as we experience the whole film seemingly in his words as he writes his tragically true love story, until we return to him in closing when he completes his novel with the end. Baz's visual stylings were evident in Moulin Rouge, often symbolic to the characters and the religious references made throughout the film, and so the Red Curtain comes to a close.
Baz.
Hey, what's going on?
So, Australia, quite different from your first three films. Where did that one come from?
Well, I'm Australian. This is Australia. I bloody love this country, so not much more to say.
Baz Luhrmann's next epic hit a lot closer to home as a beautiful homage to Luhrmann's roots and to the Australian cinema that has influenced his career. In Australia, Luhrmann revisits myths with a narrative that echoes themes of tragedy and social expectations. Inspired by Australian classics, Baz pulls at times a beautiful filter on scenes set late in the day or during the night, although the film takes place in the harsh Australian outback. Luhrmann applies his stylistic conventions to Australia again with a meticulously crafted palette, closer to the Great Gatsby's with cool tones rather than the warmer red palettes of the Red Curtain trilogy. After Baz Luhrmann's success internationally, it was fitting he returned once again for an Australian story, especially since his next project would take him back to the States for another unique Baz adaptation.
Mr. Luhrmann. So, once again, you're taking on with Great Gatsby, an amazing piece of historical fiction. Was there any worries going into this production?
Not really. I'm Baz Luhrmann. I've adapted Romeo and Juliet perfectly before, so not really. No, I'm kidding. Great Gatsby, was such an important work of fiction, and Mr. Fitzgerald had such a view on the life of the rich and famous. So I guess, you know, how self-indulgent I were. I guess me being a very self-indulgent director, I hope to have captured his hostile views towards them. And yeah.
Baz Luhrmann's most recent feature film to date is the most indulgent adaptation of The Great Gatsby, with typical Luhrmann stylistic conventions. In this motion picture, Baz revisits the myth his Red Curtain trilogy explored, completing the alternate Moulin Rouge ending by swapping the survivor roles. Luhrmann also revisits themes of social expectations and true love. One of the few ways that Baz Luhrmann's productions have changed over his illustrious career is the ethics of his main characters, growing less morally good by each film, especially by The Great Gatsby.
Over 2 decades of writing, directing and producing feature films has cemented Baz Luhrmann in international cinema history. His style and popularity have also resulted in other directing, producing opportunities, such as Netflix's series The Get Down, and several large brand commercials such as the Chanel No. 5 campaign, for which Luhrmann holds the world record for the largest budget for an advertisement campaign. As a creator of cinema, he has affected personally the Australian film industry for the better. Luhrmann introduced to Australian cinemagoers a unique stylistic interpretation to genres that have developed his filmography as one of an auteurs. There is no surety to what Baz will set his sights on next, but there is no doubt pressure to go one step greater again. One more myth from the man himself, Baz Luhrmann.
So Bazza, what's next?
Oh, I'm not sure if I can tell you it'll be big. It'll be a tragic love story, a musical, set in Australia. It's something I've never done before.
What was it like working with Leonardo DiCaprio?
Leo, he's a good kid, fantastic to work with, but star material, I don't think so.